The 7th floor of Hargrove Financial didn't belong to the partners. Everyone who worked there knew it. The mahogany doors, the private elevator that required a keycard most senior associates had never seen. None of that belonged to the men and women with their names on the letterhead. It belonged to one man, and that man's name was never spoken above a whisper in the building's lower floors. Imogen Farley had been at Hargrove Financial for 11 months, long enough to know which partners were afraid of the 7th floor, long enough to know that the junior forensic accountant position she'd accepted, straight out of Georgetown, 26 years old, still carrying $30,000 in student loans, was not the kind of job that came with a corner office and a clear conscience. But she needed it, and she was good at it. Better than anyone upstairs suspected. She was the kind of person people underestimated on sight. Small, quiet, had the kind of face that made senior partners forget she was in the room. That was fine. She'd learned to use that a long time ago. The problem started on a Tuesday in October. She was running a routine audit on Hargrove's discretionary fund allocations, the kind of work that got assigned to junior staff, because no one senior wanted to spend 3 days inside spreadsheets, when she noticed something. A number that didn't fit. Not wrong, exactly. Just slightly off rhythm. The way a note played half a beat late sounds almost right, but catches in the ear of anyone who's studied music long enough to feel it. Imogen had studied music for 12 years before she switched to accounting. She heard it. The allocation was listed under a client code she didn't recognize. Not unusual on its own. Hargrove handled over 300 active accounts, but when she cross-referenced the code against the master client registry, it came back empty. No name, no contract date, no originating partner. Just the code, and attached to it, a series of wire transfers totaling just under $4 million over 18 months, always in amounts precisely below the threshold that triggered mandatory review. She sat very still for a long moment. Then she closed the file, logged off her workstation, and went to the bathroom on the 4th floor. Not the 3rd floor bathroom nearest her desk, because she had learned in 11 months that the walls on the 3rd floor were thin, and she stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and thought very carefully about what she had just seen. $4 million. Ghost client code. Transfers calibrated to stay invisible. Someone at Hargrove Financial had been laundering money, and whoever it was, they had been doing it long enough and carefully enough that 11 months of junior forensic accountants hadn't noticed. Until now. She did not go to the partners. That was the first decision, and she made it quickly, because the question she kept coming back to wasn't whether someone had set this up. The question was who had the access and the authority to create a client code that didn't exist in the master registry, approve wire transfers without a cosigner, and keep it buried in the discretionary fund where no one looked too closely. The answer to that question pointed up. Not sideways, not down, up. She went back to her desk. She pulled a different file. She worked until 7 in the evening with her headphones in, and her expression blank, the way she always looked when she was concentrating, and when she left, she took nothing with her, except the memory of what she had seen, and a single handwritten note on a post-it she tucked into the inside pocket of her jacket. The number she'd written was the client code. She told herself she was going to sleep on it. She didn't sleep. By 3 in the morning, she was at her kitchen table with her personal laptop and a cup of tea gone cold, and she was thinking about the name she'd overheard 6 weeks ago in the elevator between the 7th floor and the lobby. 2 senior partners, voices low. One name, said once, in the tone people use for names they are both afraid of and dependent on. Aldous Crane. She knew the name the way everyone in financial circles knew it, distantly, abstractly, the way you know the name of a country you've never visited. Aldous Crane did not have a publicly traded company. He did not give interviews. He was listed on exactly one piece of public record, a single board seat at a non-profit hospital foundation 3 years old, established presumably for the tax benefit. Other than that, he existed the way very wealthy, very careful men exist, as a rumor with a net worth attached. What she hadn't known, until she spent the rest of that sleepless night pulling threads, was that Hargrove Financial had been Aldous Crane's private accounting firm for nearly a decade, and the discretionary fund she'd been auditing belonged at its origin point to a shell company that traced back, through 4 corporate layers and 2 offshore subsidiaries, to him. She found the connection at 4:47 in the morning. She stared at it for a long time. Then she saved nothing, closed everything, and went to stand at her apartment window and watch the city do what cities do in the hour before dawn: delivery trucks. A man walking a dog, an ambulance moving without its lights on, which always struck her as the saddest possible thing, an emergency that had already ended. She thought about her mother, who had worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years at a dry cleaning operation in Rockford, Illinois, and had once told her that the only honest thing about money was that it always, eventually, told the truth. The numbers always said what happened. You just had to know how to listen. $4 million. 19 months. Client code that didn't exist. Someone was stealing from Aldous Crane, and they were doing it from inside Hargrove Financial, and they had hidden it in the one fund that a junior forensic accountant would eventually be assigned to audit, which meant either the person doing it was very stupid, or very confident, or they had expected the junior accountant to be the kind of person who saw nothing, and reported nothing, and moved on. Imogen Farley was not that kind of person. The next morning she arrived at Hargrove Financial at 7:15, 45 minutes before anyone on her floor typically came in. She used that time carefully. She accessed the original digitized transfer records, not the summary file she'd been working from, but the raw scanned documentation from the originating bank, and she found what she was looking for in the signature field of the 3rd transfer. The authorizing signature wasn't a partner's. It was the firm's managing director of client accounts, a man named Prentice Wohl. 15 years at Hargrove, known internally as the person who handled the clients whose names didn't appear on the public roster. The man who Imogen recalled from an onboarding document she had read once and apparently retained with perfect fidelity, held co-signatory authority on the discretionary fund alongside the founding partner. Except co-signatory meant 2 signatures, and every transfer she pulled showed only Wohl's. She photographed the screen with her personal phone. Then she deleted the photo from her phone's visible camera roll and moved it to a folder inside a folder. Inside a folder, buried under 11 months of grocery lists and cat pictures and a half-finished recording of herself playing piano she'd never sent to anyone. Then she closed the files, made herself a coffee from the break room, and sat at her desk and waited for Prentice Wohl to arrive. He came in at 8:52. He did not look like a man who had stolen $4 million from the most dangerous private client in the firm's history. He looked like a man who had been doing exactly this job for exactly this long and expected to continue doing it indefinitely. He was wearing a blue tie. He had a paper coffee cup from the cart downstairs. He said good morning to the receptionist by name and moved to his office without looking at anyone else on the floor. Imogen watched him from behind her monitor. She thought, "He doesn't know I found it. He thinks he's safe." She spent the rest of the day doing nothing, just working, running the legitimate portions of her audit, responding to emails, attending the 11 o'clock budget alignment meeting, and contributing 2 observations about reconciliation timing that the senior associate, a man named Porter, who had explained 3 separate things to her that she already knew in the year she'd worked here, seemed surprised by. She let him be surprised. She went back to her desk. At 4 in the afternoon, she got a calendar invite. It was from Wohl's assistant. Subject line: New Client Portfolio Review, Thursday 9 a.m., Conference Room C. Her name was on the attendee list, along with Prentice Wohl and one other name she didn't recognize, A. Crane, guest access. She read it 3 times. Then she accepted the invite. She went home that evening and stood in her kitchen for a long time without cooking anything. She thought about the sequence of events. Wohl had been siphoning money from Crane's discretionary fund. Something, maybe a report, maybe a tip, maybe just routine oversight from Crane's side, had recently flagged an irregularity. Crane was coming to the firm Thursday. Wohl had added her name to the meeting, which meant either he didn't know she had found the transfers, or he did know and was trying to establish some layer of cover, a junior staff presence he could later redirect suspicion toward if needed. Neither option was comfortable. She ate cereal for dinner. She played piano for an hour, an old habit, the thing she did when she needed to think without thinking, and somewhere in the second movement of a Schubert sonata she'd memorized at 17, she made a decision. She was going to need proof that was not on her phone and not on the firm's network. She went in early again the next morning, Wednesday, one day before the meeting. The original signed paper documentation for the discretionary fund transfers, the physical copies which by regulation had to be retained in hard copy for 7 years, were stored in the records room on the second floor. She had a standard access clearance. She had a reason to be there, because she was actively auditing the fund. She went in at 7:40, when the security desk was staffed by a man named Delroy, who had worked the morning shift for 9 years, and who always had his phone out watching basketball highlights, and who had told her once, in the elevator, that the people who worried about the cameras were the people who acted like they were worried about the cameras. She moved through the records room with the unhurried efficiency of someone doing exactly what their job description said to do. She pulled the physical folder for the discretionary fund. She reviewed the transfers. She photographed each signed page on her personal phone, not hiding what she was doing, just doing it the way someone does when they're working, casually, not looking around. Then she found it. The fourth transfer had a second page, a memo attached, paper-clipped to the back which hadn't been included in the digitized record, a brief internal note, handwritten, initialed by Wohl, dated 14 months ago, 4 lines. Client verbal authorization confirmed, code per usual, no documentation at client's request, fund draw to proceed. Amounts adjusted for threshold compliance. She read it twice, then she photographed it and put the folder back exactly as she found it. Amounts adjusted for threshold compliance. He had written it down. He had actually written it down. The arrogance of someone who had been invisible for so long they'd stopped believing anyone could see them. She left the records room at 8:15. She went to her desk. She emailed herself the photos, personal address only, and then immediately deleted the sent email from her firm account, so there was no digital breadcrumb on the Hargrove network. Then she opened her audit file and continued working. At 10:30, Prentice Wohl walked past her desk without looking at her. He was carrying a folder. His face was calm in the practiced way of people who have learned to keep their faces calm regardless of what's happening underneath. She watched him disappear around the corner toward the elevator. She thought, tomorrow morning. She did not sleep well Wednesday night either. She lay in the dark and thought about what she knew and what she could prove, and the distinction between those two things, which had been the subject of the 3rd lecture in her forensic accounting program, and which she had written in her notes as, knowing is not the same as demonstrating. You must always be able to demonstrate. She could demonstrate. She arrived at conference room C at 8:58 Thursday morning. 2 minutes early, because she was always 2 minutes early for things that mattered. The room was large, with a glass wall facing the corridor and a long table that seated 12. Wohl was already there. He acknowledged her with a nod, the barely perceptible kind that meant he was aware of her presence and had already categorized her as unimportant. That was fine. At 9:04, the door opened, and Aldous Crane walked in. She had seen photographs. They were not adequate. He was taller than he looked in images, and there was something about the way he moved through the room. Not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate, each step considered, that made the room rearrange itself around him. He was wearing a dark suit with no pocket square and no tie, which somehow managed to suggest that he had decided formality was optional for him personally, while still applying to everyone else. He had the kind of face that had probably been striking at 30 and had settled into something more formidable at whatever age he was now, which she estimated at somewhere between 40 and 45. 2 men came in behind him and positioned themselves near the door without being asked. They looked at the room in the way that certain men look at rooms, not admiring it, not examining it, assessing it. He sat down across from Wohl without looking at Imogen at all. Wohl began the presentation. It was fluent and detailed, and it was also, she recognized immediately, a carefully constructed narrative designed to redirect attention away from the transfers she'd found. The fund was performing, the diversification strategy was sound. The minor irregularities in the December cycle were attributable to a processing delay during the banking holiday period. He did not rush. He had clearly prepared thoroughly. He was good at this. She sat at the far end of the table and listened and waited. Crane had not looked at her once. At 9:26, Wohl paused to allow for questions. Crane looked at his phone. Then he said in a voice that carried easily without being raised, "The fourth quarter transfers." Wohl said, "The December cycle, as I mentioned, had a processing." "Not December," Crane said. "September, October. The prior November, 18 months of transfers. Client code 774 Whiskey. Walk me through those." The room went very quiet. Wohl's face did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted, a rapid recalibration that she recognized because she'd learned to watch for it. The moment a person realizes that the conversation they prepared for is not the conversation they're having. "That account," Wohl said, "is a discretionary vehicle used for—" "It doesn't exist," Crane said. "I've had my people check. Client code 774 Whiskey doesn't appear in any registry associated with this firm, which means someone created it internally, without authorization, and used it to move money in amounts specifically calibrated to avoid regulatory review." "Silence," Wohl said carefully. "I'd need to pull the documentation." "You wrote the documentation," Crane said. "It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was the flattest, most certain thing Imogen had ever heard said in a professional setting, and she felt the temperature of the room change the same way it did when weather shifted. Not gradually, but all at once. Wohl said nothing. Imogen looked at the table. Then she looked at Crane. He was, for the first time, looking at her. "You're the auditor," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Junior staff." He said it the way people say things they have already confirmed elsewhere and are now verifying. "Forensic accounting. 11 months. You were assigned this fund. Standard rotation," she said. "I found an anomaly on Tuesday." Crane looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Wohl, and Wohl was looking at the table, and she thought that Wohl was doing the math the same way she had done it and arriving at a number he did not like. She said, "There's a memo." Both men looked at her. "Physical copy in the records room," she said. "Paper clipped to the fourth transfer in the hard copy folder, initialed by Mr. Wohl. It documents the methodology." She paused. "It's handwritten, 14 months ago." Wohl said very quietly, "You were in the records room." "I was auditing the fund," she said. "It's my job." The next 4 seconds were the longest she had experienced in professional memory. She was aware of the 2 men near the door. She was aware of Wohl. She was aware that the thing she was doing right now was not the safe thing, and that she had known it would not be the safe thing when she decided to do it, and that she had decided to do it anyway because there was a version of this where she stayed quiet and attended the meeting and let whatever Wohl had planned unfold, and that version ended with her name on a meeting attendee list when the fraud investigation arrived, and she had not spent 4 years at Georgetown and 11 months building a spotless record to let someone else's crime become her proximity. Crane said, "Do you have a copy? Yes, on you, yes." He held her gaze. She held his. There was something happening in that exchange that she didn't fully have language for. Not the usual dynamic between a man with that kind of money and a 26-year-old junior accountant from Rockford, Illinois. "Something closer to recognition," he said. "Show me." She opened her phone. She pulled up the photographs, and she set the phone on the table between them, screen facing up, and she slid it the 4 feet across the table's surface without looking away from him. He looked at the screen. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at Wohl. What happened after that did not require her to do anything else. One of the men near the door moved. Wohl stood up, but standing was all he managed before the man was beside him. one hand on his arm, not rough but immovable. Wohl said something about his attorney. Crane said one sentence, not to Wohl, to the man holding his arm. And the sentence was in a language she didn't speak, and then there were phone calls being made in the corridor, and someone was calling the elevator, and Prentice Wohl, managing director of client accounts, 15 years at Hargrove Financial, was being walked out of conference room C on the 34th floor of a midtown office building. At 9:31 in the morning, the glass door swung closed. Crane was still sitting across from her. She retrieved her phone from the center of the table. The silence lasted long enough that she thought, I should say something. But she didn't know what, and she had learned that filling silence was almost always a mistake when you weren't sure what the silence meant. So she waited, he said. You could have reported this to the partners. The transfers required founding partner co-authorization, she said. I didn't know whether the partners knew. I still don't. He looked at her with an expression that she suspected was as close to surprised as his face regularly got. So you held it, he said, until I could verify what I had and who I was dealing with. You knew who you were dealing with. I knew your name, she said. That's not the same thing. Another silence. Longer this time. He said, How much did you find? 4,300,000 across 19 wire transfers over 18 months. Amounts calibrated to stay beneath automated review thresholds, funneled through a ghost client code created internally, which means someone with systems access above the junior staff level. The memo documents intentionality. She paused. There may be more. I was 3 days into the audit. He was quiet. I can finish it, she said, if you want to know the full number. He looked at her for a moment that went on long enough to make her aware of it. Then he said, Why would you do that? It took her a second to understand what he was actually asking. Not why would you do the audit? Why would you continue, knowing what you know about who I am and what this money is and where it comes from? She thought about Delroy at the security desk with his basketball highlights. She thought about her mother's 30 years of bookkeeping, the particular pride she'd had in a clean ledger at the end of the year. She thought about the note in her jacket pocket that she'd written on a post-it 3 days ago, a client code that didn't exist in any registry. Because the numbers are wrong, she said, and wrong numbers bother me. Something happened to his face. Not a smile. Something quieter than that and somehow more significant. He said, You'll have a new title and a new floor. He looked at the glass wall, at the corridor beyond it, at the elevator bank at the far end. Starting Monday, she said, the 7th floor. Yes, she thought about 11 months on the 4th floor. She thought about Porter explaining reconciliation timing to her. She thought about the elevator between the 7th floor and the lobby, and 2 partners speaking in low voices, and a name said once with the quality of something both feared and required. She said, I'll need full access to the client account database. He said, You'll have it. And I work independently. No one reviews my findings before I report them. To you directly. He looked at her with the same expression as before. Not quite surprised, not quite something else, hovering at the precise edge between them. That's not how this firm operates, he said. That's how I operate, she said. Given that the person who operated differently just got walked out of the building. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had a different quality than the earlier silences. Like the pause between a question and an answer where the answer is already known, but neither party has said it out loud yet. He said, Monday. She said, Monday. She stood up. She picked up her notebook and her phone, and she walked to the glass door of conference room C and she pushed it open, and she was 3 steps into the corridor before she heard him say, behind her not loud, Imogen. She turned. He was still sitting at the table, hands folded in front of him, looking at her across the length of the room with an expression she would think about later, in her kitchen, standing at the counter at 11 o'clock at night. It wasn't the expression of a man who had just recovered $4 million. It was the expression of a man who had just found something he wasn't expecting and had not yet decided what to do with it. He said, The numbers, do they always talk to you like that? She considered the question. "Since I was 14, she said. First time I audited my school's booster club accounts for a civics project." A pause. They were short $800. The athletic director was buying equipment from his brother-in-law at inflated prices. A beat. "What happened?" he said. "I gave the report to the principal," she said. "He resigned 3 weeks later." Something moved through Crane's face, quiet, contained, but unmistakable. "And you've been doing this ever since," he said. "Finding what people try to hide in the numbers," she said. "Yes." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned, and she walked down the corridor toward the elevator. And she pressed the button for the 4th floor, because she still had a desk there, with 11 months of careful, invisible work on it, and she intended to clean it out very neatly before Monday. Behind her, the doors of Conference Room C remained open, and somewhere above her, the 7th floor waited.